To move the motion.
Mr. Walker, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it is truly a privilege to once again lead a debate in Westminster Hall. And I beg to move that this House has considered the provision of long-term capital for business. The subject matter of this debate, long-term capital for business, is a critical issue for the future of our economic well-being. Business knows business best, and in many ways the industry panel review on patient capital is the genesis of this debate. Their review, published in October 2017, was written by experienced and successful business leaders, and I commend it to members of the House. Of course, I recognise that today's debate is somewhat overshadowed by what is happening in the chamber of the House of Commons and what will transpire later this evening. That said, I can't think of a better time to be holding a debate on this subject. These are critical days for the future of our country, and we will be making critical decisions. And it is incumbent upon us as members of Parliament to put the long-term interests of our country at the heart of the decisions we make. Our country, its people, and those who come after us will not thank us if we make our decisions solely on the narrow, short-term or selfish interest viewpoint. And what is true for our country in our current predicament is also true when it pertains to the fortunes of business. While there are undoubtedly risks in making strategic decisions for the long term, there are greater perils, in my view, in only considering the tactical here and now, in looking for immediate returns and being unprepared to consider the bigger picture that a view to the long term necessitates. I'm afraid that one of the lessons of life that we sadly must keep learning is connected to what is often described as the law of the harvest. You can only reap what you were prepared to sow in the first place. The harvest comes in due season, but you must be prepared to be patient. I want us to reflect on the pitfalls of short-termism, the missed opportunities and failures of a lack of a long-term vision. Now, as every colleague who has ever worked with me in my previous business career would be able to attest, I'm no accountant. But for me, it is insightful that in accountancy terminology, long-term investment is defined as an investment that is to be held for more than a single year. And a single year, Mr. Walker, hardly seems like long-term to me. We have, quite rightly, heard a great deal about the UK productivity gap. Productivity is defined by the Office of National Statistics as the output per worker, output per job, and output per hour. And this is ordinarily calculated by the annualised GDP per capita divided by the average annual hours worked per employee. Countries with a track record of rising productivity tend to benefit from higher rates of growth and low inflation. And it's the golden fleece of national economics, if I may describe it as such. Productivity in the UK over the past few years has not been our best feature. In international comparisons, we rank poorly compared with other developed economies. We are currently at number 17 in world rankings, with our average hourly productivity across the economy being £17.37, compared to the Germans, who produce £23.30 per hour, the Americans, who produce £25.74 an hour, and the Danes, who produce £28.87 an hour. Imagine for a moment, Mr. Walker, that we were as productive as the most productive of the developed economies. It would be transformative to our fortunes. We could pay ourselves more, and as a result of paying more in taxation, we could invest many billions more in our NHS and other public services. The increased profitability in the private sector would also yield increased dividends, which in turn would be good news for our pension funds.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder if he's looked at how many countries have a means of producing long-term capital and what sort of competitive advantage that would give us as a result.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that very timely intervention. That's the very point that I wish to come on to. So let's examine the reasons, perhaps, the critical reason for this lack of national productivity. And again, looking globally, let's compare the levels of investment in our economy with those of the world's leading economies. A good indicator is the level of gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP. Now, this is just a single measure. Gross fixed capital formation is the value of the acquisitions of new or existing fixed assets in the economy, less the disposal of fixed assets. In 2017, which is the most up-to-date figure that we have from the World Bank, we invested 16.8 pence for every pound of GDP. The Chinese invested 41.8 pence for every pound of their wealth. And looking across the Western economies, the developed economies, we lag significantly. Italy is 17.5. Poland, 18 pence. Germany, 20.3 pence. Denmark, 20.4 pence. Spain, 20.5 pence. France, 22.5 pence. Finland, 22.6 pence. Canada, 23 pence. And Belgium, 23.3 pence. Well, this is but one measurement of investment. It says something about future business activity, and it also says something about our confidence in the future. And it's my firm belief that much of our productivity gap in this country is due to this indicative investment gap. We are simply not investing enough, and my contention is that this is because there is an insufficiency of quality patient capital in our economy. And it's a much-worn anecdote that while we come up with great ideas, breakthrough technologies and transformative product concepts, all of that good stuff ends up being commercialised somewhere else by someone else. And as a young Scot, my pride in being a Scot was spurred by the great stories of our inventors, scientists and engineers. I believe it is a valid contention, one which I'm prepared to stand by, to say that the modern world was largely designed by the Scots. And the litany of great Scottish contributions includes James Watt, Alexander Graham Bell, John Logie Baird, and delighted to give way at this point to my honourable friend.
Built by the Irish, especially the Ulster men.
A timely intervention as ever from my honourable friend. But this great litany of greats, John Logie Baird, Alexander Fleming, James Chalmers, John Dunlop, these islands, these British Isles, are a crucible for invention. It is the genius of the people of these islands, the creative free thinking, the imagining the unimaginable, which in turn has created whole new branches of science and technology and whole new categories of product. And that creative spirit, that native entrepreneurial spirit, is alive and kicking, Mr. Walker. Entrepreneurs are among us in abundance. The number of startups in this country is at an all-time high. Entrepreneurs are launching themselves and their ideas onto the high seas of enterprise in greater numbers than at any time in our past. Our universities and other research institutes are brimming with exceptional people having very bright ideas. And some of these ideas, if carefully nurtured through the commercialization process, will not only continue to change the modern world for the better, but will be the source of the wealth of this nation for generations to come. But it must be nurtured. And that nurturing is in part, I would argue, a substantial part, down to the availability of long-term patient capital. What happens all too often at the present is that these small to medium-sized businesses fall prey to predators who invest in them for the short term and then sell on without having made the necessary long-term commitment to bring the businesses to their full potential. No, I'm not arguing against the importance of short-term investment or venture capitalism, but I am arguing that it is wrong to surrender our whole economy to this model of capital. 650,000 new companies were formed in Britain last year, but the number of companies which scale up is relatively small. Now, some of these are lifestyle businesses that suit the people running them, but many business owners are driven by a sense of purpose. They set out to build a growing, successful business, and that they very often come up against the obstacle of the limited availability of patient capital.
I thank you very much for giving away again. He's been very generous. One of the major industries that I think he may be about to come on to, I don't know, is the digital industry.
Yeah.
That is such a fundamental part of our economy, and that is a fundamental part that needs investment. As I know from my own costs when I ran a company that was involved in that area.
Mr. Walker, anyone would think that my honourable friend and I are working in some form of symbiosis, because the very next thing I wanted to say was that this idea, this need, is never more pertinent than in the technology sector, where large American corporations invest speculatively and then buy companies when they reach a sufficient level of development. And one of the reasons that so many British businesses go this way is that they have reached a stage where their access to affordable long-term capital dries up. And so this isn't just about startups. This is about how a business accesses capital to be able to invest in new assets or new capabilities.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. My honourable friend is making a very valid point about the actual access to capital that companies are going to their mid-stage course of development. He makes the point about size, but is it not also about geography? Many companies, especially across Scotland and in Northern England, that are further away from some of the capital bases in London and Edinburgh, don't get that same access to capital. And actually, it's incumbent on us to make sure that people can be, and our companies can be connected to capital so they can grow in the way we should all want them to.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and near neighbour for that very valuable contribution. I will come back to that idea shortly. So this isn't, as I said, Mr. Walker, just about startups. This is about how businesses access capital to be able to invest in new assets or new capabilities. I'm afraid there is an abundance of evidence to suggest that we have a capital investment system which is addicted to short-termism. There's also an abundance of evidence to suggest that we have a capital investment system which is adverse to risk. And risk is built into the capitalist system. Investment, by definition, includes a calculation of exposure to risk. The more risk-averse we become, the less we're inclined to invest in new ideas or new ventures because they might fail. The returns might not materialise. It is implicit, I would argue, essential to the free enterprise economic system. There is an acceptance of the inherent risk of failure. However, anecdotally, we have become less willing to accept that risk. The banks obviously were badly burnt because of their recklessness in respect of risk. They then set about recapitalising their businesses at the expense of small and medium-sized businesses, which led to some of the gross abuses and alleged criminality, which is still the subject of ongoing inquiry. And this is an outstanding injustice, which is still to be remedied. I don't want to spend too long on the past misdemeanours of the banks. We've had many debates on that subject in Westminster Hall and in the Chamber, and I'm sure we will have plenty more. But restoring confidence to the small and medium-sized businesses of this country necessitates that something is done about the scandals of the past decade. Banks will not take a long-term view, and if we entrust our productivity to them, we will have no long-term economic future. I certainly don't want to be guilty of using this debate as a platform to spread doom and gloom. That is not in my nature, Mr. Walker, because there are very many good examples of private sector long-term investment. City Fibre is a good example. They're investing £10 million in sterling, which will make fibre-to-premise ultra-fast broadband available to every household and business in the city. Sterling will soon become one of the top digital cities in the United Kingdom, something that I am proud of. But when we take in the bigger picture, City Fibre is investing £2.5 billion across the UK, and it's an investment which will take many years to recoup. But the investors have faith in their product, and they are willing to be patient while the company makes its money back. Their planning horizon is measured in decades. Now, that is something akin to my definition of long-term investment. And around the world, many countries, while not having this this particular set of problems, have a different set of capital, system of capital deployment. I'd like to pause on the German example. I've used this before in Westminster Hall. I've already explained that they have, in the German economy, successful indicators of productivity and capital investment. KfW is the German National Development Bank and came about as a result of the Marshall Plan and was set up for the purposes of post-war reconstruction. It supports infrastructure investment, lending some 47 billion euros. It acts as a lender to local authorities, but most importantly, it supports small and medium-sized enterprise. In 2017, it lent some 8.2 billion euros to small and medium-sized enterprises for startups and scale-ups. They lend money, they provide equity funding, and they also provide mezzanine financing to cover all aspects of capital investment. 90% of its funding is from the private sector in the form of debt that is backed by bonds. It is owned in partnership between the federal government and the individual states, and it doesn't appear on the national balance sheet of the Federal Republic of Germany. As the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, we will no longer have access to the European Investment Bank. This bank invested over £2.5 billion into the UK in 2018. This was our money that was invested, gleaned from borrowing on the back of the British taxpayer. But we will need to find a way to replace this level of financing, because there will be a hole in the capital provision landscape. We need to look at the investment bank model in detail. It would fulfil the need for a patient capital investment vehicle as outlined in the industry panel review. In the case for a major intervention in this way is, in my opinion, justified. The lagging productivity in our economy is a major risk to our economic prosperity, and we need action now. This cannot wait any longer. It especially can't wait until after we've resolved the issue of Brexit. Our thinking in this area is a vital part of our preparations for our economic well-being after we have left the European Union. Now we have a British business bank, which has some of the functionality of a national investment bank. So there is a tacit acceptance by government of the problem I've been attempting to describe. The big issues, as I see them and understand them, with the British Business Bank is it doesn't seem to have equal coverage across all parts of the United Kingdom.
Will you join me in welcoming some of the expansion of the British Business Bank announced in the budget, which places actually people on the ground in Scotland, which is something that him and I have been asking for since we actually came to this place?
Yes, and that's a very important point of information, which I'm very grateful for. It is important that the British Business Bank has representation in all parts of the United Kingdom. But currently, it is still limited in its mission because of its limited scope of operation, and it doesn't really behave like a bank, even though it's in the title. Its model of supplying finance via existing investment funds means that its base of operations is quite limited and seems to favour, if you'll forgive me, the southeast. I am happy to be corrected, but the British Business Bank doesn't seem to have the kind of extensive operation on the ground that it needs in Scotland, even with the announcement in the budget. And I'd like to see the British Business Bank operating across the breadth of the United Kingdom, interacting with the economy on the basis of a clearly defined mission, including small and medium-sized businesses, operating at arm's length from the UK government, raising its own capital rather than being a channel through which public funds are simply disbursed. Now, I'm not being critical of the British Business Bank as it stands, because I'm a fan, but I'm advocating that it evolve into something more. That something more is what the industry panel Patient Capital Review advocated, namely an investment vehicle to support the scale-up of British businesses and capital-intensive startups. By investing in equity directly through such a vehicle, we can harness the wealth of our nation to deliver on the promise of the industrial strategy and to make our economy fit for the future. Mr. Walker, the UK economy is dominated by its service sector. And there's nothing amiss about services, but we need to rebalance our economy, and we need the availability of long-term capital to become the best country in the world to build a business. In the post-war era, there have been too few British businesses that have grown to become multi-billion-pound global corporations. But there's more that we can do. We should look at other ways of releasing underproductive cash for equity funding. We need to take a healthier approach to our risk appetite as a country. So changing the culture is essential. We need to harness our savings and our pensions with some innovative mechanisms that we can unlock this money and put it to use in our economy. On using the tax system and the savings guarantee system in new innovative ways, we could revolutionise the way that companies get finance and the ultimate source of that finance. Helping people to acquire equity stakes through shareholder cooperatives, savings schemes and direct micro-investments could all work towards a new culture of investment. To that end, we need the Treasury to be as innovative as the entrepreneurs who fuel our economy. We need to see ideas being tried and tested and the apparatus of government swinging behind the idea of long-term investment and rewarding those who make those investments. A starting point would be to increase the thresholds on the tax on dividends and to seek to ban it to allow smaller-scale investors to pay no tax whatsoever, especially on dividends, especially if they can be incentivised to maintain their investment over a longer period. Mr. Walker, coming to the industrial panel review on patient capital, as I conclude, they made a number of recommendations which need to be addressed. They identified the need to provide patient capital to help entrepreneurs to be successful. I've already mentioned their idea for a patient capital investment vehicle. They also propose a licence scheme to allow patient capital investment companies to be founded, which would be venture capital funds licensed to raise money from markets guaranteed by government. And while I agree with this recommendation, it needs to be a truly national venture with specific guidance about the development of capital funds outside of London and the South East. They also propose a change in the way that taxation hits investors when they seek to invest in developing a company past its start-up phase, ensuring that tax incentives, I correct myself, for equity and venture capital funding are there when companies are seeking capital to expand rather than simply during the start-up phase, will allow investment to flow more freely into medium-sized companies. Now, I have a few asks of the government before I sit down, and they're quite straightforward. Firstly, I would like to see a formal response to the industry panel review alongside an action plan for implementation of its recommendations. I may have missed it. I'm, again, happy to be corrected. Secondly, we need a full analysis of the possibility of a national investment bank or development bank, as I outlined earlier. And thirdly, we need a statement about the replacement vehicle for the investments made by the European Investment Bank, which we will no longer have access to. And finally, I would like to ask for some reassurance from the Minister that the Treasury is ready to innovate to improve the availability and the quality of long-term capital. We need to encourage a positive investment culture, and we need a creative response from the Treasury to unlock and harness the wealth of this nation in the delivery of a modern industrial economy fit for the future. And my hope in bringing this debate to Westminster Hall was to focus the House on the substance of how we can improve the environment for entrepreneurial success and wealth creation. It is perfectly understandable, Mr. Walker, that we have become distracted by the politics of Brexit. One day soon, I hope and pray, we will turn the page on Brexit, and that this House will fully turn its attention to the vitally important agenda of ensuring the long-term productivity of our economy. It is timely because it is about our future.
We have 18 minutes before wind-ups. So I'm going to call Jim Shannon. Jim, please don't be more than 6 minutes. Thank you.
Calling me. Can I congratulate the honourable gentleman for Stirling? In the short time he's been here, he has made a name for himself and on the issues that he brings to this chamber. Well done to him. And also, Mr. Walker, good to see him back to his health again after the time of illness that he had just before Christmas, and well done. The issue is very important to me. The banking and financial conduct industry is one which is increasingly becoming interesting to me. Many debates, those of us who are here today, will reflect that. What began with constituents highlighting individual cases that were concerning for the individuals have, after time, and a lot of hours, left me increasingly concerned about the entire sector. And I believe it is entirely right and proper that we bring to the attention of the Minister today in the chamber, in this place, for his attention, and more important, for his action. And I look forward to the Minister's response at the end of the debate. I read the report of the Patient Capital Review Industry Panel and completely agree that there is an urgent need for a mechanism to realise three aims. Firstly, unlocking institutional and retail investors' capital. Secondly, increasing the number of venture capital funds that can deploy patient capital at scale, and increasing returns to scale up investments. I wholeheartedly agree as well that the United Kingdom is in many respects a great place to start and grow a business. In recent years, successful government policy interventions such as the Enterprise Investment Scheme, the Venture Capital Trusts have helped develop a thriving start-up community, and Northern Ireland has become the world capital for cyber security due to investment in skill provision and adjustments for businesses to invest in the province. We welcome that, and we're very, very pleased and very proud to say that. Only in December, US cyber security firm Imperva announced that it will create 220 jobs within its new Belfast base. Again, continuing job improvements and opportunities coming all the time. It's expected to bring the total number of cyber security jobs in Northern Ireland to over 1,500 for the first time. And that is a 15-fold increase in the past 10 years. So it's really, really good news. And I'm pleased to report that to the House today. The reason for this is due to the concerted effort to find space in the market and to provide all that is needed. We have businesses that seek to make the most of that, but are prevented due to the lack of affordable capital investment. And this is where I believe government must invest in the long game and make the provision. We all know the phrase speculate to accumulate, and how real and how true that is. I am, Mr Walker, no man's fool, as you know, and others in this chamber know as well. And I can well understand that ideally this funding capital should come through the private sector. But to build in a post-Brexit age, it is imperative we put our money where our mouths are and invest in ourselves in order to establish and encourage international confidence in the United Kingdom outside of Europe. I support this panel's view to addressing these issues, such as the creation of the patient capital investment vehicle to enable the aggregation and deployment of both retail and institutional capital for investment in UK scale-up businesses and capital-intensive R&D-based businesses. We have to invest in those types of sectors to do better. We will invest a £1 billion annually, primarily in UK venture capital funds and other investors in high-growth businesses, catalyse an additional £2 billion of private investment by providing up to only 30% of the equity capital. A bit tactical, Mr Walker, but nonetheless it explains perhaps how the system works. This vehicle will be a new entity, independent from the UK government, but with a government-defined mandate, and including some government investment to signal strategic intent and stability. So again, I would ask the Minister in his response to our comments what the intention of government will do with that, because if it can help, and I think it can help and will help, it will be a step in the right direction, and will we all benefit from across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In order to attract institutional capital, investments in the PCIV might receive a favourable capital treatment, similar to the PRA's treatment of bank investments in the Business Growth Fund, the BGF. The phrase go big or go home seems to be in operation here, but the gains are as necessary as oxygen, and that's the message is clear. The fact that this nation believes in its worth and ability, and this nation backs itself as a global leader. Just to comment finally, Mr Walker, we must, again, I use the phrase speculate to accumulate. Businesses are ready and waiting. We have proven it in Belfast and Northern Ireland. If we plan ahead and get the skills pool full, the investment, the jobs and the boost to the economy will most certainly follow. I believe in this wonderful United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and you know we're better together, and that's a fact. But Chair, I pose the question to the Minister. Does government, if it does, Minister, show it and sow it, and then we can all reap the harvest? Thank you.
I am going to call Luke Graham, who's going to speak for 5.5 minutes because he's a really good guy. Thank you.
Mr Walker, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'll try and do even shorter than that if possible, because I want to make three very, very quick points. One is talking about the regional nature and the importance of capital spreading out around the United Kingdom, also about innovation, but then finally just to ask the Minister to always think in the British interest and look past what is, don't let devolution be a barrier for investment across the United Kingdom. So, Mr Speaker, I mean, my honourable friend from Serving, made some fantastic points about the importance of long-term, future glimpse, a long-term importance of patient capital across the United Kingdom. I think that's even more important. It's not just the regions around the UK that we always talk about, the regions of England and Scotland as a whole. It's the regions within Scotland, and even further than that, it's the counties and towns within Scotland as well. In my constituency of Auckland, South Perthshire, we're a particularly rural constituency. We're also in Clackmannanshire, a post-industrial county, and in that county there we've been starved of investment for a very long time. It's important that both public and private investment is connected here and it's funneled here as easily and as simply as it is, as I see in many of the incubators that happen in and around London and also around the universities of Edinburgh, Oxford and Cambridge. There are some great models out there, and we just need to expand them to other parts of our constituencies and other parts of our countries. Secondly, Mr Walker, I think it's also important about innovation. We have a fantastic opportunity ahead of us to really capitalise on the financial centres we have in Edinburgh, in Belfast, in London, to look at new innovative solutions, not only in company models, not only in ways and types of financing, but also at the actual infrastructure that can be used across the country. I've written before about reintroducing regional stock exchanges as a way to try and raise more local capital. It was used a lot in the 19th century to help pay for some of the railways that now connect our country, and it could be used again to help fund infrastructure from everything from broadband to additional road infrastructure to additional company infrastructure, and especially when trying to encourage more rural investment, could help some of the communities raise funds locally as well. And it's important, I think, Mr. Walker, that the government actually plays a full part in creating a real ecosystem. It is not there to make every decision. It's not for our constituents and our companies to live on the government's shilling. It's actually for government to to put its money into infrastructure, to make sure it's developing the framework that enables private enterprise to really flourish, and make sure any public investment are there to stimulate in research and innovation, and to back the entrepreneurs that do so much for our country and for our individual communities. So as I say, the government really can be more innovative here. Brexit doesn't need apply. It can look at things like rural stock exchanges. It can look into rural enterprise zones. It can look in expending the powers of the British Business Bank as well, as my honourable friend said, to make it a true investment bank. So finally, Mr. Walker, I'd just like to reiterate the point and a little bit of frustration that I've had since I've come to this place. Sometimes, and I know it's not from my honourable friend who's in this place speaking for the Treasury just now, it appears as if the Treasury is not so much a British Treasury, but sometimes more of an English Treasury. And it becomes incredibly frustrating when you're trying to fight for projects in Scottish constituencies. I know it's held for members across in other parts of England and in Wales, and Northern Irish colleagues seem to do quite a good job at it, but in other parts of the UK as well. And I would just encourage the Minister to always remember that we are still one country, and that as British ministers, we need British investment decisions. And even when areas may be devolved, there is no law, and we've checked this in the House of Commons Library, there is no law to stop Westminster investing in devolved areas. This has been an artificial barrier that has been set up through a cultural shift in the civil service, and also, I know it hasn't been helped by the current administration in Edinburgh either, but it's one that doesn't need to be a barrier. And moving forward, Mr. Walker, what we should seek to try and do as British parliamentarians is not see devolution as a barrier, but to make sure that we're working across every single level of government to make sure investment is coming from the centre and reaching our frontline communities. So make sure that when we increase the block grant, as my honourable friend has done, and we increase the block grant to Scotland, that money goes through to our local council services, which it isn't at the moment. It also makes sure that when we're, as individual MPs, lobbying for projects in our constituencies, that money comes from Westminster directly for our constituencies. Infrastructure needs more, Mr. Walker. Our governmental frameworks need more, and the government has it within its power to create an ecosystem to take all the innovation and energy of the United Kingdom and really increase the prosperity for all of our constituents. And I hope my honourable friend would outline some of his vision for that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate the honourable member for Stirling for securing this very important debate. And I wasn't aware that he was unwell over Christmas, but I'm delighted to see him in the pink of health here today. Mr. Walker, it's a rare treat to be in a debate with two Tories and a DUP member where I've got to pick my differences in the speech, in the speeches that they've made so far. I think there have been many points that I could agree with across the chamber here today. Particularly, I've got to say, the honourable member for Stirling was talking about productivity. It's long been an issue that I've talked about. It's been holding back business, has been holding back people for far too long, and I agree with his sentiment. As a result of paying more in taxation, we can invest more in our services. That's the result of getting that kind of result in productivity. I can also agree with the comments made about that lack of focus across the nations of the UK, and indeed it does feel like an English treasury. It does to us. We make that point on a regular basis, but I think it is also a fact that the South East factually gains far more traction than any other part of the UK, including the regions of England, including Northern Ireland, including Wales. So, you know, there is a lot to agree with in that as well. Having this debate today, though, is particularly poignant, I think, and although I think members of the government, particularly those in favour of Brexit, would like it to be ignored in this debate, I don't think it can be ignored that the biggest threat to business access to finance actually comes from Brexit. It's already reducing customers, workforces and confidence. Instead of building our economy, investors are voting with their wallets, pulling nearly £20.6 billion from UK equity funds since the vote in 2016. according to the EPFR. I'm delighted to give
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He's raising the point about Brexit being a threat. But will he agree with the developer who's currently developing in Alloa, in my constituency, that actually the biggest threat to raising finances wasn't Brexit, but was indeed the threat of a second independence referendum?
It's absolutely no surprise to the honourable member that I absolutely don't agree with his policy. He's just gone from making an absolutely sterling point about the English Treasury to saying that independence is somehow a threat. I don't think so. I think it's a marvellous opportunity, and I think since he's raised the issue, I think it's been brought into sharp focus over recent months in this place. As Marion Bell, Alpha Economics, pointed out, businesses told to prepare for a no-deal Brexit have relocated operations, and these decisions may not be reversed, even in the event of the best possible economic outcome, even if that is remaining in the EU. The UK's service sector has recorded the slowest sales growth in 2 years as Brexit inches closer. That's from the British Chambers of Commerce. Their survey of 6,000 British firms also shows that labour shortages and price pressures continue to persist. Now, Scotland is a world leader in patient long-term capital, but Brexit risks lenders following the example of a well-known honourable member in moving business to Dublin or to the continent. We're being mogged over Brexit, Mr Walker. In the face of austerity, we do have to make different decisions in order to support business. The Scottish Government is bringing forward the Scottish National Investment Bank, which will provide patient, long-term capital to support Scotland's firms in the future. In contrast, as we've heard, the UK Green Investment Bank, which was privatised by the Government and now is bereft of its UK focus. The aim there is for the Scottish National Investment Bank to be investing in businesses and communities by 2020, subject, of course, to regulatory approval. And backed by our commitment of at least £2 billion investment in the first 10 years, paving the way for a step change in innovative and inclusive growth. But we also welcome the plan for a Scottish Stock Exchange in the second quarter of 2019, with a focus firmly on social and environmental companies worth between £50 million and £100 million. The plan has now secured a partnership agreement with major European stock market operator Euronext, and the first Scottish Stock Exchange will be operating since the closure of the trading floor in Glasgow in 1973. Mr Walker, all of this is done in the shadow of Brexit, a vehicle solely aroused to calm Tory infighting, and has as much chance of success for business as the chaos reigns on their benches as it does for the economy of our people, who are ultimately paying the price, and so are businesses in the long term.
Those would now speak for the SNP for 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Walker. It's a pleasure to serve yet again under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for Stirling on securing this important and sometimes quite consensual debate. The honourable member has spoken quite fully and passionately and with a great deal of knowledge and expertise on how we can best provide businesses across the UK with ongoing patient long-term funding. I would point out, though, that when I learned accountancy, long-term funding was generally between 7 to 10 years and further on, rather than just over a year. That's a blast from the past. It's many years since I did accountancy. I was very interested to hear him talk about productivity and to refer to Denmark, a very small, independent nation which is leading the charge on productivity. Long may Scotland follow. He also talked quite briefly about the reasons for national productivity being linked to levels of investment, and how, especially in Scotland, we've been a very innovative country, but companies start to slow down and fail because they cannot get the correct long-term investment. And yes, this is a real and ongoing issue. But the honourable member for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey talked about the Scottish Investment Bank, which we do hope to see fully functional, or starting to become fully functional in the early 2020s, because that will be a huge boost to small industries in Scotland. The honourable member also talked about the lack of money that we'll now see coming from Europe, and how, and looked quite favourably on how German small companies, and this is something that for many years this country has been looking enviously at Germany, and we need to really take on board what they do to help businesses. He also really calls for tax incentives, and he is talking about needing a full analysis of the National Development Bank to look on what they're going to do post-Brexit. The Honourable Member for Strangford, of course, gave us his usual and very full and frank views on where things in Northern Ireland are going, and talked about the cyber security industry and how that is really helping, and how the United Kingdom, of which he's a great proponent, should be investing in ourselves post-Brexit. He wants the government to help in this. In fact, I think the Minister has a lot of explaining to do as to how he's going to move things forward. The Honourable Member for Ochil and South Perthshire mentioned that devolution should not be a barrier to development. And yes, I would totally agree with that. I mean, on many occasions, colleagues of mine have stood in the chamber and asked about city deals, where the Scottish Government has invested increasing amounts in various city deals, but not getting the same amount of money from the Treasury. Yes, I'll give you very briefly.
I thank the lady for giving way. Does she recognise, and having been in negotiations on 2 city deals of impact to my constituency, does she recognise that the obstacles are not just from central government to the devolved administration, but also devolved to the central government as well? So if there is a little bit of give, does she appreciate it has to be on both sets of the argument?
I would agree that in any negotiations there has to be give on both sides, but I would agree that the Scottish Government is giving more in a practical sense, and that's really what people in city deals in Tayside and Stirling and other areas in Scotland are really concerned about. It's very important also, I think, that when we touch back on the idea of innovation and moving small businesses forward, that we look at regional stock exchanges, as mentioned by the Honourable Member for Ochil and South Perthshire. I was very interested that my honourable friend talked about the Scottish Stock Exchange closing in 1973 in Glasgow, and I think they even renamed the square Nelson Mandela Square instead of, because it was Stock Exchange. I remember it being Stock Exchange Square for many years. I think that we will all be very interested to hear how the Minister responds, because none of us in this place disagree with the need for long-term patient funding for businesses to thrive and grow, increase prosperity for all of our citizens, and to increase the economy in Scotland and in the rest of the UK.
Shadow Minister.
Very much, and it's a delight to see you in the chair, Mr. Walker. Can I congratulate the honourable member, who I'm glad to see is back in his rightful place after his illness before Christmas. Can I thank the honourable members for Ochil and Berkshire, Strangford, Inverness, and other beautiful places around it, and of course Motherwell and Kilshire, who's just completed there. I think patient capital has got to be set in the context of a wider economic perspective, not just on its own. And the structure of our economy has fundamentally changed over the past 4 decades. In the early 1980s, 26% of jobs were in manufacturing, compared to only 8.1% now. In 1948, 46% of GDP came from the service sector. Now it's 80%. And that's largely due to the decisions made by successive governments, which effectively is saying as long as headline growth was strong and the welfare state redistributed sufficiently, it didn't matter where the growth came from. But of course the financial crash and its aftermath has demonstrated clearly that this theory was wrong, and that reliance on an unfettered and highly volatile financial sector has not worked for the vast majority of people and businesses. Headline growth may have recovered, but it's still pretty sluggish. And nothing exemplifies this than the way banks have shifted their activities actually away from lending to businesses. According to the IPPR's Commission on Economic Justice, across a whole range of economic indicators, the UK exhibits serious underlying weaknesses. On investment, research and development, trade and productivity, we perform worse than most of our European neighbours, and have done so not merely over the last 10 years, but for much of the last 40 years. Productivity, as the Honourable Gentleman has said, and investment are stagnant. And that seems to be the way of the economy at the moment, and it's got to change. A 2017 report by the Scale Up Institute highlighted significant capital barriers to the growth of business beyond the start-up phase in the UK, and of course Brexit. But I'll leave that to other people to talk about. I won't. What we've got is other countries using state direction and innovation and investment to carve out vital areas of expertise in robotics, in electronic cars, in clean tech, in the smart city. And we, from Labour's side, have a National Transformation Fund and a £250 billion worth of lending by our National Investment Bank and a network of regional development banks, enabling us to transform our economy over the first 2 terms of a Labour government, to reconnect the financial sector to the economy with research and development and production. That will transform our financial system. We'll establish a strategic investment bank, the sort of bank that the Honourable Member thinks is good, and he's absolutely right in that regard. And it will comprise of various agencies, organisations, and of course members of this House. And we will use the power of government to unlock the lending power of the private sector, unlocking the lending power of the private sector. We will deliver lending to SMEs across the UK through new regional development banks. And our investment strategy will no longer accept the disparities, as has been identified here, across the regions. That is a crucial element of any policy of a government, to make sure there is equity right across our nations, whichever nations they actually are. So from our side, we want to invest in people and ensure that businesses can access highly skilled workforce, and that's why we'll be setting up our National Education Service, allowing everyone to upskill and retrain at any point in life. And it comes back to the point, it isn't just about patient capital investment, it's the ecosystem and the infrastructure also around that particular investment. So from our side, we do want patient capital investment, and we hope that we will be able to set the scene, set the environment for that patient capital investment to develop, and ensure that all our regions, and all our nations, all our cities and towns are able to get access to that patient capital over the next few decades. Thank you very much, Mr. Walker.
Minister. Well, thank you, Mr. Walker. And can I begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Stirling, for raising this important issue and exhorting the United Kingdom Treasury to look to all parts of our union. If my history of the Treasury serves me correctly, I think the last Treasurer of Scotland was in 1708. He was sent to the Tower and then to the House of Lords, as they did in those days. But since then, the Treasury has firmly been an institution of the whole of the United Kingdom, and long may it continue. And I thought that he made some very important points this afternoon, encouraging us, above all, to look to the long term and to ensure that both government and the private sector is constantly trying to ensure a free flow of long-term capital that will grow the economy and drive the country forward. Since we came to power in 2010, we have made it easier for people in this country to found a business and to grow those businesses, scaling up British businesses so that the UK is one of the best places in the world to be an entrepreneur. And a new business is created in this country every 75 seconds, and compared with 2010, there are now 1.2 million more businesses in the UK creating jobs and prosperity. But we're not complacent. We understand the need to increase access to long-term capital, to address the structural challenges facing the British economy, including our productivity gap, and to make the UK more globally competitive. So I thank him for his comments today, and in particular for his thoughts on a national investment bank, which I'll return to in a moment. In the UK, we already have, and it's important to remember, a strong equity finance market. It's one of the engines of the economy and a national and indeed international asset for the UK. We continue to be the top destination for VC investment in Europe, attracting around a third of total European venture capital investment in 2018. But the patient capital review, which he referenced, which we commissioned, and reported back on in 2017. The budget in 2017, and we updated it again at the most recent budget with a one-year-on update, provided the response that he's referred to the panel and those experts that we commissioned at the Treasury to investigate this issue. It did conclude that there is more for the UK to do to close the funding gap and help our most innovative firms to reach their true potential. At the budget in 2017, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, unveiled a plan to unlock over £20 billion of additional finance for those innovative firms over the next 10 years. Since then, we have launched that vehicle, British Patient Capital, which he referred to, and seeded it with £2.5 billion of public money. We've expanded the investment limits for venture capital trusts and for the enterprise investment scheme, doubling the amount of the UK's most innovative businesses can raise. And we've announced the creation of a knowledge-intensive EIS fund structure to help stimulate further investment in R&D-intensive firms and to concentrate our incentives on those firms that we think will have the greatest benefit to the British economy. And we've worked with representatives across the industry to unlock pensions investments in patient capital through our Pensions Investment Task Force. With total assets under management in the UK expected to exceed £1 trillion by 2025, we know that defined contribution pension schemes are set to be one of the most important institutional investors in the UK. And that's why at the budget this year, the Chancellor announced a pensions investment package to enable DC pension providers to invest in long-term, innovative UK companies. Of course, as part of a balanced portfolio, and we don't believe it's the role of government to instruct independent pension trustees how they choose to invest on behalf of the pension holder. But we do believe that encouraging them and breaking down barriers will ensure a greater flow of capital for venture capital and for long-term, somewhat higher risk investments that will drive the economy forward. We've done a number of things to take forward that agenda. Firstly, we announced that the FCA will be carrying out a consultation on small tweaks to their permitted linked rules. That was published in December 2018. And we announced that the DWP will consult this year on making the pension charge cap flexible enough to accommodate performance fees often associated with patient capital investment. And finally, we announced that some of the largest DC pension providers in the UK will now work with the British Business Bank to develop a blueprint for pooled investment in patient capital, enabling those who are perhaps too small or don't yet have the appetite required to take part in this important form of illiquid investment. We believe these will make a great deal of impact in the years ahead. But we're not just limiting our efforts to equity funding. We're also committed to ensuring that businesses can seek the right finance for their growth needs. And that is exactly why the British Business Bank was launched some time ago, which we've heard about today. The British Business Bank is rolling out a UK network, including in Scotland, to resolve regional issues and increase its cut-through with business people and entrepreneurs throughout the Union. It operates through partners, such as high street banks, business angels and venture capital, but it will and should be doing that in all parts of the United Kingdom. To give honourable members some of the most recent statistics, as of November of last year, in Scotland it had provided almost £900 million of finance to over 9,000 SMEs. In Northern Ireland, £114 million to more than 2,200 SMEs, and in Wales, almost £500 million of finance to more than 6,000 SMEs. We hope, of course, that will continue, and it will take its responsibility to operate in all parts of the United Kingdom very seriously. And I encourage honourable members to engage with the British Business Bank if they haven't done so already. In terms of infrastructure, which we've heard about today, as a government, we've made an important decision, one of the first decisions of my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, upon becoming Chancellor 2.5 years ago, to significantly increase the amount of public investment in our economic infrastructure. And over the course of this Parliament, public investment in our infrastructure, including in digital and in transport, will reach levels not seen in this country since the early 1970s. we want to ensure that that also feeds through into the private sector. And if we want to deliver on those plans, and we now have a £600 billion pipeline of infrastructure investment, it will need to be a partnership with the private sector, financed and delivered privately. So a thriving private sector is extremely important, and that is something that we need to consider when we take into account some of the comments we heard earlier in terms of political risk in this country, both due to a breakup of the union, but also the opposition's policies of privatising utilities, of nationalising utilities, rather. The government supports investment using a range of tools, including stable independent regulation, which we have some of the best and most admired in the world. Of course, there are ways in which we can improve that. And in the budget, we commissioned the National Infrastructure Commission to consider ways in which we can make our independent regulators more innovative and improve the regulatory model, but not to throw it aside. We use contracts for difference in renewable energy, and we have the £40 billion Treasury UK Guarantee Scheme, which plays an important role. As we announced at the budget, we are now reviewing our existing support for infrastructure finance to ensure that as we leave the European Union, we continue to ensure that good projects in the United Kingdom receive the finance that they deserve. We're also making a number of interventions to support new technologies where we believe that the public and private sector can work together, the public investing to crowd in private sector investments. Two notable examples, most recently one with digital infrastructure and the latter with electric car charge points, where the government has put in £200 million worth of investment. We believe there's more scope for these in the future. With regard to the European Investment Bank, it's important to remember that we don't see a significant funding gap emerge since the referendum. We do have very mature markets in the UK for infrastructure investment, for privatised utilities, for example. But the Chancellor has made clear, and we noted this again in the political declaration, that we're actively exploring options for a future relationship with the EIB, as it does with other third countries. One can't be a member of the EIB if one isn't a member state. And we are interested in the proposal to create a UK infrastructure investment bank. My honourable friend has laid out some of the arguments for that. We think there are important arguments there, and this will be considered as part of our review of infrastructure finance, announced in the budget and upon which we'll be giving some more details shortly. We think that can play an important role, and although I wouldn't overstate the impact of the European Investment Bank in the British economy or in our infrastructure finance, there are reasons to believe that it played an important role, and we believe that we could find our own way forward as we leave the European Union. In terms of smaller businesses, helping them to scale up, as we've heard, is extremely important. The UK has a good record for creating start-up businesses, but not as good a record as we'd like for ensuring those businesses to scale up and really create jobs and prosperity for all parts of the UK. That is a challenge that we've set at the British Business Bank, and that's working to support investment, such as creating regional pools of capital. We've done so with the Midlands Engine and with the Northern Powerhouse, and there may be further scope to do so in the future. We're very engaged in those questions. We're engaged with the question of geographical spread of venture capital and business angels, as was raised by my honourable friend from Oakhill and South Perthshire, to ensure that individuals and entrepreneurs have access to capital wherever they choose to set up their business and don't feel the need to come to London or the South East to do so. And finally, through the tax system, we are continuing to make the UK the most competitive environment we can for entrepreneurs and investors. We're doing that through Entrepreneurs Relief, through SCIS, EIS and VCTs, which we're continually trying to improve and ensure that in the UK we have the most highly competitive market we can, directly comparing ourselves and renewing those comparisons with the US, with France and with Germany. So I'm grateful to my honourable friend from Stirling and from those other honourable members who participated in the debate today. I hope that they can tell the government's commitment to this agenda, the work that we've done quite intensively over the last 2 years and will continue to do in the months and years ahead. We will continue to welcome thoughts and contributions to help inform those decisions in the future. Mr. Kerr, if you'd like to wind up for the last 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. It was perhaps a portent that throughout the Minister's speech I could hear cheering from outside, but it entered the chamber, and I must confess there are many points in his speech where, frankly, I would have joined in the cheering. So I was greatly encouraged by what he had to say in the positive and upbeat way in which he talked about the government's approach to the concept of spreading this change of culture in relation to long-term capital. I would just like to conclude by thanking all members for their thoughtful speeches, including those who would normally be political opponents, but who couldn't resist banging on again about independence. But we'll overlook that. And I'm very grateful as well to the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Strangford, who hits the right note when he talks about confidence in the future. I believe in our United Kingdom. I believe in the genius of our people, and I believe our future is bright, and we should have faith in it.
The question is that this House has considered provision of long-term capital for business. As many of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The sitting stands adjourned. Order, order.